The salvage ship Harmony's Edge moved slowly through the floating pieces of metal and plastic that had once been the colony ship New Seoul. Captain Lee Minho sat in his command chair and watched the broken hull pieces drift past their windows. 3 months had passed since the last message from Earth. 3 months since any human colony had answered their calls. The silence was getting harder to bear each day. Minho looked around at his crew of 12. They were all that remained of humanity in this part of space. Engineer Park Ji-won worked at her station near the back of the bridge. She was young, maybe 25, with short black hair and hands that never seemed to stop moving. She had joined the crew 2 years ago when they picked her up from a failed mining station. Now she kept their old ship running with spare parts and determination. "Captain, I'm picking up something strange," said First Officer Kim Tae-hyung. He was staring at his scanner display with a confused look. "There's a big ship hiding behind that chunk of debris. Really big." Minho stood up and walked over to look at the display. The object was massive, at least 10 times bigger than their little salvage vessel. It had sharp angles and dark metal that seemed to eat the light from nearby stars. The design was nothing like human ships or any of the friendly alien races they had met before. "Could it be one of ours?" asked Communications Officer Lee Yuna. She was the youngest crew member at only 22. Her job had become mostly useless since the Great Silence began. No one was talking to anyone anymore. "No," Minho said quietly. "That's not human. That's not anything we've seen before." Down in the engine room, Park Ji-won was fixing the quantum scanner for the 3rd time this week. The old machine kept breaking down, and replacement parts were impossible to find now that the supply lines from Earth had gone quiet. She worked alone, which was how she preferred it. When no one else was around, she would hum old songs her grandmother had taught her back on Earth. The songs were from Korea, passed down through her family for generations. Her grandmother used to sing them while cooking dinner or working in her small garden. The melodies were simple but beautiful, filled with feelings of longing and hope. Ji-won found that humming these songs made the endless silence of space feel less empty. She was humming Arirang when the ship's alarms suddenly started ringing. The sound was so loud and unexpected that she jumped and nearly dropped her tools. Captain Minho's voice came over the ship's speakers. "All crew to stations. We have contact with an unknown vessel." Ji-won quickly put away her tools and ran to the bridge. When she arrived, she could see the massive alien ship through the main window. It was even more frightening in person than on the scanner display. The hull was covered in what looked like armor plates, and she could see weapon systems that were bigger than her entire ship. "It's powering up," Tae-hyung reported, his voice tight with fear. "Energy readings are off the charts. Those weapons could turn us into dust without even trying hard." A red beam of light suddenly shot out from the alien ship and hit the Harmony's Edge. The beam passed right through their shields like they weren't even there. All over the bridge, warning lights started flashing as their systems overloaded from the scanning energy. "They're taking a very close look at us," Yuna said. "This isn't just a scan. They're reading everything about our ship, our crew, even our DNA." Through the bridge windows, they could see movement inside the alien vessel. Huge shapes moved behind transparent sections of the hull. Then one of the shapes came close enough to the window that they could see it clearly. The crew of the Harmony's Edge fell silent in terror. The creature was 3 meters tall and built like a living weapon. Its body was part organic flesh and part mechanical parts, with 4 powerful arms that ended in devices that glowed with deadly energy. Its head was covered in armor plates, but they could see burning red eyes underneath. This was something made for war, designed to kill without mercy or hesitation. More of the creatures appeared at different windows along the alien ship's hull. They were all staring at the small human vessel with what looked like hungry interest. Some were holding weapons that pulsed with contained destruction. Others had tools that looked designed for taking ships apart piece by piece. "Captain," Dr. Joe Hansel whispered from his science station, "I'm reading massive biomechanical modifications on these beings. Their original biology has been heavily changed. They're living weapons." The alien ship sent them a message, but it wasn't in words. Instead, it was pure electromagnetic aggression that made their radio equipment scream with feedback. The sound was like the roar of a predator that had found prey trapped in a corner. It was a challenge, a declaration that the humans belonged to them now. Mino felt his heart racing as he looked at the faces of his crew. They were all young people who had joined his salvage operation to see the galaxy and maybe make some money. They didn't deserve to die like this, torn apart by living weapons in the dark between stars. "Send a response," he ordered Yuna. "Tell them we're peaceful, we're just salvage workers, we don't want any trouble." But before Yuna could touch her controls, Park Ji-won did something that no one expected. She walked over to the communications panel and opened a channel to the alien ship. The massive weapons on the enemy vessel were charging up, ready to fire. In seconds, the Harmony's edge would be nothing but scattered atoms. Ji-won began to sing. Her voice carried the melody of Arirang, the ancient Korean song about crossing mountain passes and waiting for loved ones to return. The words spoke of sadness and separation, but also of hope that somehow, some way, the people you cared about would find their way back to you. Her grandmother's voice seemed to echo in her memory as she sang the verses about longing and love. The effect was immediate and impossible to believe. The alien ship's weapons stopped charging. The massive creatures visible through the windows went completely still, as if they had been turned to stone by the simple human song. Across their vessel, warning lights stopped flashing and the electromagnetic roar fell silent. On the bridge of the Harmony's edge, 11 people stared in amazement as Park Ji-won's song somehow stopped a war before it could begin. Park Ji-won's voice traveled through space as radio waves, carrying the melody of Arirang to the massive alien ship. The song was simple but filled with deep emotion. It spoke of mountains and separation, of waiting for someone you loved to come home. Her grandmother had sung this same song while working in her kitchen, teaching young Ji-won that music could heal sadness and bring people together. Inside the alien vessel, something impossible was happening. The huge warriors who had been preparing to destroy the human ship suddenly stopped moving. Their weapons powered down without orders. Some of them dropped the tools they were holding and just stood there, listening to the strange sounds coming from the tiny salvage ship. Commander Vexen stood in the command center of his warship and felt his mind breaking apart. For 47 years, he had known only battle. His people, the Nexari, had been changed by their masters long ago. Their feelings had been burned away and replaced with computer programs that only understood war and conquest. They were living weapons designed to feel nothing but the joy of destroying enemies. But this sound from the human ship was doing something to his brain that should have been impossible. The song was creating patterns in his mind that his masters had tried to erase. Deep inside his modified skull, old pathways were waking up, connections that had been buried under layers of battle programming. As Ji-won continued to sing, Vexen began to remember things. Flashes of images appeared in his mind like lightning. He saw a world with blue skies and green plants. He saw young Nexari singing together in groups, their voices creating beautiful harmonies. He saw himself as a child before the masters came, before everything changed. The memories hurt worse than any battle wound. His people had once been a race of musicians and artists. They had filled their world with songs and stories, with art that celebrated life instead of death. But the hegemony had found them and decided they would make good soldiers. They had taken away everything that made the Nexari who they were and turned them into weapons. All across the ship, other warriors were having the same experience. Tech operator Krelm fell to his knees as he remembered his sister's voice singing lullabies. Weapons Master Thys put down her energy rifle and touched her face, feeling tears for the first time in decades. Navigation Officer Zenth stared out at the stars and remembered when they had seemed beautiful, instead of just targets to conquer. On the human ship, Captain Minho and his crew watched in amazement. The alien vessel that had been ready to kill them was now completely still. The massive warriors visible through the windows were not moving. Some of them seemed to be crying, though that seemed impossible for creatures that looked so fierce. "What's happening to them?" whispered Dr. Cho Hansel. His scanners were picking up strange changes in the aliens' brain patterns. The rigid mechanical thoughts were becoming chaotic and organic, more like normal living beings than programmed weapons. Ji-won finished Arirang, but didn't stop singing. She moved to another song her grandmother had taught her, Doraji, about gathering flowers in the mountains. Then she sang Gang Gang Sulai, an ancient song about women dancing together under the moon. Each melody seemed to reach deeper into the alien minds, unlocking more memories and feelings that their masters had tried to destroy. Commander Vexen remembered his real name now. Not the military designation the hegemony had given him, but the name his parents had chosen when he was born. Keleth. In the old language, it meant harmony seeker. He had been someone who loved music and poetry, who wanted to explore the universe and learn about other cultures. The hegemony had taken that person and buried him under programs and machines, but somehow this human song was bringing him back to life. Other ships began to appear from behind the debris. More Nexari vessels that had been conducting their own salvage operations in the area. As Jiwan's songs reached them through radio transmissions, the same thing started happening on each ship. Warriors who had known only battle for decades suddenly remembered who they used to be. Captain Thoros of the warship Death's Edge clutched his command chair as memories of his daughter flooded back. She had died when the hegemony converted their world, but he had forgotten her face until this moment. Now he could see her clearly, laughing as she played with toy ships in their garden. Engineer Vilek stopped working on her weapon systems and began to cry. She remembered teaching younglings to sing on her homeworld, how their small voices had filled the air with joy and wonder. The hegemony had told them that such things were weakness, that only strength mattered. But the human song proved they were wrong. Across 7 different ships, thousands of Nexari warriors experienced emotions they thought were gone forever. The careful programming that kept them obedient was breaking down as older, deeper parts of their minds took control. For the first time in decades, they were remembering what it meant to be alive instead of just weapons. When Jiwan finally stopped singing, the silence felt different than before. It was not empty like the great silence that had cut off the human colonies. Instead, it was full of possibility, heavy with the weight of change that could not be undone. Commander Keleth, as he now thought of himself, walked slowly to his communication station. His hands shook as he activated the transmitter. He had to try several times to remember how to send a peaceful message instead of a threat. Finally, he managed to create a simple mathematical pattern that all spacefaring races would understand as a request for dialogue. The message he sent to the human ship was very different from the electromagnetic roar of before. Instead of aggression and dominance, it carried curiosity and hope. The pattern meant, in the universal language of mathematics, "Please sing more." On the bridge of the Harmony's Edge, Communications Officer Lee Yuna stared at her display in shock. "Captain," she said quietly, "I think they want to talk." Captain Minho looked at Park Ji-won, who was still standing by the radio controls with tears in her eyes. She had no idea what her songs had just accomplished, but somehow her grandmother's melodies had reached across the void between species and touched something that their enemy's masters thought was dead forever. "What should we do?" asked First Officer Kim Tae-hyung. Minho looked out at the alien fleet surrounding them. 7 massive warships that could destroy entire planets were waiting for his response. But instead of feeling afraid, he felt something he hadn't experienced since the Great Silence began. He felt hope. For the next 6 hours, Park Ji-won sang every song she could remember. She sang children's lullabies her mother had hummed while braiding her hair. She sang pop songs from the colonies and classical pieces from Earth's great composers. She sang work songs that farmers used during harvest time and sad ballads about lovers separated by war. Each song seemed to unlock something different in the Nexari warriors. The lullabies made them remember being young and innocent. The work songs brought back memories of building things instead of destroying them. The love songs reminded them what it felt like to care about someone more than yourself. Captain Minho watched through the bridge windows as the alien fleet changed before his eyes. The sharp, aggressive formation they had first seen was breaking apart. The warships were moving into a protective circle around the small human salvage vessel, like they were guarding something precious instead of preparing to attack it. Commander Keleth's transformation was the most dramatic of all. As Jiwan's songs continued, his biomechanical body began to reject the hegemony's modifications. Computer chips that had controlled his emotions started to malfunction. Artificial muscles that had been designed for killing began to remember gentler purposes. He stood in his command center and felt 47 years of buried personality flooding back into his mind. He remembered his childhood on the green world of Nexar Prime, where his people had lived in harmony with nature and each other. He remembered the day the sky had filled with hegemony ships, how his parents had hidden him in the root cellar while their city burned above. The conversion process had been terrible beyond words. The hegemony surgeons had cut open his skull and inserted machines to control his thoughts. They had replaced parts of his body with weapons and armor. They had shown him images of violence until he forgot what peace looked like. They had told him over and over that his old life was weakness, that only strength and conquest mattered. But Jiwon's music was stronger than their programming. Each melody dissolved another layer of artificial control, bringing back pieces of who he used to be. Keleth remembered that he had once been a teacher, someone who helped young Nexari learn about art and music and philosophy. The hegemony had turned him into their opposite, but they had not been able to destroy him completely. All across the fleet, similar awakenings were happening. Captain Thoros of the Death's Edge began dismantling the torture chambers in his ship's lower decks. He remembered now that his people had once been healers and gardeners, not killers and destroyers. The rooms that had been used to break prisoners would be converted into medical bays and growing chambers for food. Engineer Vilek started working on her ship's weapon systems, but not to make them more deadly. Instead, she was trying to turn them into tools for construction and exploration. Her hands remembered how to create instead of destroy, how to build things that would help people instead of hurt them. Communications Officer Lee Yuna worked with the Nexari to establish proper translation protocols. What she discovered changed everything they thought they knew about the galactic situation. The hegemony was not just another aggressive empire trying to expand its territory. It was something far worse, a plague that consumed entire civilizations and turned them into weapons against others. The Great Silence that had cut off human colonies wasn't random system failures or natural disasters. It was the hegemony moving through human space, cutting off communications and isolating each world before striking. They had done this to 17 other species before humanity, each one falling to their converted armies of former victims. "They're coming for Earth," Keleth explained to Captain Minho during their first real conversation. His voice was rough from disuse, but the words carried terrible certainty. "The hegemony has been preparing for this conquest for months. They have studied your species and decided that humans would make excellent soldiers." The news hit the crew of the Harmony's Edge like a physical blow. Dr. Cho Hansel had to sit down as the full scope of the threat became clear. "How long do we have?" he asked. "The main fleet will reach your core worlds within 2 months," Keleth replied. "They have already begun the softening operations, cutting off your colonies one by one. When they attack Earth, your people will be alone and confused just like all the others." But Jiwon's accidental discovery had created an opportunity that no one had expected. If music could break the hegemony's conditioning in the Nexari, it might work on other converted species as well. The plague that had consumed 17 civilizations might finally have found its cure. "We need to test this on other species," said Dr. Hansel. "If we can prove that the conditioning can be broken universally, we might be able to turn the hegemony's own armies against them." Keleth's eyes burned with an anger that had been buried for decades. "My people have been slaves for 47 years. We have been forced to destroy worlds that should have been our friends. If your music can free others the way it freed us, then we will help you spread it to every corner of the galaxy." The plan that began to form was audacious beyond measure. They would travel to systems where other converted species were operating, broadcasting Jiwon's songs on frequencies that could reach their modified brains. They would create a rebellion not of weapons and ships, but of awakening minds remembering who they used to be. First Officer Kim Taehyung looked at their small salvage vessel, and then at the 7 massive warships that now served as their escorts. "We're really going to do this, aren't we? We're going to try to save the galaxy with folk songs." Captain Minho smiled for the first time since the Great Silence began. "If it works for them," he said, nodding toward the Nexari ships, "it might work for everyone. And if we can free enough converted soldiers, the hegemony will find themselves fighting their own armies." Park Jiwon stood quietly at her station, still amazed by what her grandmother's songs had accomplished. She thought about all the other humans scattered across the colonies, waiting in fear for something terrible to happen. They didn't know that help was coming in the form of ancient melodies and half-remembered lullabies. But first, they had to prove that the cure could work on more than just the Nexari. They had to find other converted species and see if music really was the universal language that could break any chain. 3 days later, the combined human and Nexari fleet arrived at coordinates that Commander Kelleth had kept secret for over a decade. Hidden in the shadow of a dead star, protected by sensor-blocking radiation, was something that the hegemony had tried to wipe out, but never quite succeeded in destroying. The Phantom Coalition was the last hope of 17 conquered worlds. Representatives from 12 different species had gathered their surviving ships and people in this hidden place, planning what most believed would be their final attack on the hegemony's core systems. They had been preparing for months, knowing that their chances of success were almost zero. Captain Minho stood on the bridge of the Harmony's edge and stared in wonder at the secret fleet. They were crystalline ships from the Threnody homeworld, their surfaces reflecting starlight like diamonds. Massive bioships from the Vorthan Collective, pulsed with internal energy. Sleek metal vessels from a dozen other races floated together in the darkness, united by their hatred of the enemy that had destroyed their worlds. "They think we're here to attack them," Kelleth explained as warning signals came from the Coalition fleet. 7 Nexari warships appearing in their secret base would normally mean death for everyone here. Communications Officer Lee Yuna worked quickly to establish contact with the Coalition command ship. It took several minutes of careful explanation before the other ships stopped targeting them with their weapons. Even then, many of the alien captains remained suspicious. The Coalition's leaders met aboard a neutral vessel, a modified cargo ship that served as their mobile headquarters. Captain Minho found himself sitting at a table with beings he had only read about in xenobiology textbooks. Thane Brightwing was a Velthir freedom fighter, whose people had once lived in harmony with sentient forests. Node Prime Quasar represented the Zenthari, a cybernetic race that had achieved perfect balance between organic and artificial intelligence. "You claim that singing can break hegemony conditioning," Brightwing said in his musical voice. His skin had a green tint that reminded Minho of leaves and sunlight. "This seems impossible. We have tried everything. Electromagnetic pulses, neural viruses, even psychic attacks. Nothing has worked." To prove their claims, Kelleth agreed to let Coalition scientists examine his brain with their most advanced scanners. What they found amazed everyone in the room. The hegemony's control implants were still in his skull, but they were completely inactive. More importantly, his original neural pathways had been restored to full function. "The modification network is still there," reported Dr. Zalay, the Coalition's lead scientist. Her Kethrin physiology allowed her to interface directly with scanning equipment, but it has been bypassed by the original biological systems. It is as if the brain remembered how to route around the artificial components. Dr. Cho Hansel worked with the Coalition scientists to understand exactly what Jiwan's music had accomplished. The hegemony's conversion process didn't actually destroy the original personality they discovered. Instead, it built layers of artificial neural networks on top of the existing brain structures. Like covering a painting with layers of new paint, music, particularly complex harmonic patterns, created resonance effects in the brain tissue that could disrupt the artificial networks without damaging the original structures underneath. It was like using sound to carefully peel away the new paint and reveal the masterpiece that had been hidden beneath. Every converted warrior in the hegemony is potentially a prisoner in their own mind, Dr. Hansel explained to the assembled Coalition leaders. "They're all waiting to be freed, but they don't even know they're trapped." The implications were staggering. The hegemony commanded millions of converted soldiers across hundreds of star systems. If even a small percentage of them could be awakened, it would create the largest slave rebellion in galactic history. The Coalition's small fleet of survivors could become the spark that ignited a fire across the entire galaxy. But there were challenges they hadn't anticipated. When they tested Jiwan's Korean folk songs on a captured Threnody warrior, the creature's crystalline body structure began to vibrate so violently that it nearly shattered. The harmonic frequencies that worked for organic brains were dangerous for beings made of living crystal. Each species will need different musical approaches, realized Park Jiwan as she watched the Threnody warrior's body slowly stop shaking. "What frees the Nexari might kill the Threnody. We need to find the right songs for each type of conversion." The Coalition had prisoners from several converted species in their detention facilities. These beings had been captured during raids and were kept alive for intelligence gathering. Now they became test subjects for the most important experiment in galactic history. For the Threnody, they discovered that low-frequency vibrations worked better than complex melodies. Tibetan throat singing created the right resonance patterns to awaken their buried consciousness without shattering their crystal matrices. The Vorten, beings made of controlled plasma energy, responded to electronic music with heavy bass lines that matched their natural frequency patterns. Each successful awakening brought new allies and new information about hegemony operations. The freed prisoners became eager volunteers in the growing resistance movement, sharing intelligence about fleet movements and weak points in the enemy's defenses. Captain Minho found himself thrust into a leadership role he had never wanted. The coalition commanders looked to humanity not for military strength, but for something far more powerful: the ability to return souls to those who had been robbed of them. "We have a plan," Thane Brightwing announced during their final strategy meeting. "The hegemony has staging areas throughout the galaxy where they gather converted forces before major campaigns. If we can broadcast the awakening songs to these locations simultaneously, we can trigger mass rebellion events before they have time to react." The plan was dangerous beyond measure. They would need to split their small fleet and attack multiple targets at once, relying on speed and surprise to overcome overwhelming odds. If they failed, the hegemony would adapt their conversion process to block musical interference, and the window of opportunity would close forever. "What about Earth?" asked First Officer Kim Tae-hyung. "The main fleet is still heading for our homeworld." Kelleth stood up from the table, his massive frame casting shadows in the dim meeting room. "Leave the hegemony's main fleet to us. My people have 47 years of anger to work through. When we broadcast the awakening songs to their converted armies, they will remember what the hegemony took from them." Park Ji-won looked around the table at beings from a dozen different worlds, all united by their desire for freedom. Her grandmother had always said that music was the language of the soul, but she could never have imagined that it would become the key to liberating souls across the galaxy. "When do we begin?" she asked. Thane Brightwing's leaf-colored skin seemed to glow with determination. "Tomorrow we take back the galaxy, one song at a time." The operation began at exactly 0800 Galactic Standard Time across 7 different star systems. The Coalition fleet had split into small groups, each one carrying specialized broadcasting equipment and recordings of the music that could free different species. Park Ji-won's voice would travel across thousands of light years, carrying her grandmother's songs to minds that had been enslaved for generations. Captain Minho commanded the primary strike force, heading for the hegemony's largest staging area in the Kepler sector. Their target was a massive space station where over 50,000 converted warriors were preparing for the final assault on Earth. If they could awaken even half of those soldiers, the balance of power would shift dramatically. The Harmony's Edge had been modified with Nexari technology, its small communications array boosted to planetary broadcast strength. Park Ji-won stood in the newly constructed transmission chamber, surrounded by equipment that could carry her voice to every ship and station within a light year. She thought about her grandmother, about the quiet evenings spent learning old songs in their small apartment on Earth. "Remember," Dr. Cho Hansel said over the intercom, "each species needs different musical patterns. Start with the Nexari frequencies, then shift to Threnody resonance patterns, then Vorthen electronic harmonics. The sequence is critical." Across the galaxy, other coalition teams were beginning their own operations. Thane Brightwing led a strike force to the Vega system, where hegemony bioships were massing for a campaign against the outer colonies. Node Prime Quasar took his cybernetic vessels to the Altair staging ground, where artificial intelligence constructs served as the hegemony's computational backbone. The first sign that their plan was working came from the Proxima team. Commander Vilex, the former Nexari engineer, reported massive disruptions among converted Threnody crystal ships. The throat-singing recordings they were broadcasting had triggered mass awakenings, turning an entire battle fleet against their hegemony commanders. "We have confirmation," came Vilex's excited voice over the long-range communicator. "The Threnody remember their homeworld, their crystal gardens, their song sculptures. They are broadcasting awakening frequencies to other Threnody ships throughout the sector." In the Kepler system, Ji-won began her transmission with Arirang, the song that had first awakened Commander Kelleth. Her voice carried across space to the massive hegemony station, where thousands of converted warriors suddenly stopped their preparations for war. In the weapons bays, Nexari soldiers put down their energy rifles and stared at the walls as memories flooded back into their minds. The effect spread like wildfire through the station's corridors. Converted beings from a dozen different species heard the music and felt their artificial programming break down. In the command center, hegemony overseers watched in horror as their perfect soldiers began to remember who they used to be. Jiwan shifted to the low-frequency throat singing that awakened Threnody warriors. The crystalline beings aboard the station began to resonate with the sound, their bodies creating beautiful harmonics that spread the awakening effect even further. Crystal guards abandoned their posts and began singing together, their voices creating patterns of light and sound that had been forbidden for decades. Then came the electronic music for the Vorthan plasma beings. Heavy bass lines and synthesized melodies reached into their energy-based consciousness and reminded them of the electromagnetic symphonies their species had once created among the stars. Vorthan technicians stopped maintaining the station systems and began pulsing with natural energy patterns instead of artificial control frequencies. But the hegemony was not defenseless. As reports of mass defections reached their central command, they began implementing Emergency Protocol 7. Throughout the galaxy, loyalist forces that remained under complete control received orders to eliminate any converted warriors showing signs of independent thought. On the Kepler station, battle-hardened hegemony shock troops began moving through the corridors, hunting down awakened soldiers. The newly freed warriors were confused and disoriented, easy targets for enemies who still felt nothing but the desire to destroy. "We have a problem," reported First Officer Kim Tae-hyung from the Harmony's Edge. "Hegemony loyalists are killing the awakened soldiers faster than we can free them. They're going to massacre everyone we just saved." Commander Kelleth's voice came over the radio from his position near the station. "Then we go in and get them. All Nexari ships prepare for boarding operations. We will not let our people die as slaves after tasting freedom." The battle that followed was unlike anything in galactic history. Awakened warriors fought alongside their former enemies against the hegemony forces that had enslaved them. In the station's corridors, recently freed Nexari soldiers protected confused Threnody crystals while Vorthan energy beings used their plasma powers to cut through loyalist barricades. G1 continued broadcasting even as explosions shook the transmission chamber around her. Her voice became a beacon of hope for beings who had forgotten what hope felt like. She sang every song she could remember, mixing Korean folk melodies with classical music from Earth and even pop songs from the colonies. The turning point came when a group of awakened Vorthan engineers managed to access the station's communication systems. They began broadcasting G1 songs throughout the hegemony's command network, carrying the awakening frequencies directly to other installations across the galaxy. Similar battles were raging in 6 other star systems as coalition forces fought to protect the minds they had just freed. The liberation that G1's songs had triggered was turning into the bloodiest conflict the galaxy had ever seen, with former slaves fighting their former masters for the right to remain free. Reports came in from across known space. In the Vega system, awakened bioships were turning their weapons against hegemony command vessels. In the Altair sector, freed artificial intelligences were taking control of entire computational networks and broadcasting awakening signals to their enslaved brothers. But the cost was terrible. For every mind that was freed, dozens died in the fighting that followed. The hegemony had spent centuries perfecting their control systems, and they were willing to destroy everything rather than lose it. "Captain," Communications Officer Lee Yuna called out over the sound of battle, "I'm receiving a priority transmission from Earth. It's the hegemony main fleet. They're demanding our immediate surrender." The message that followed chilled everyone on the bridge. The hegemony commander spoke in perfect English, his words carrying the cold certainty of absolute power. "Your interference ends now. Surrender immediately, or we will destroy Earth and every human colony. You have 1 hour to comply." Captain Minho looked at Park Ji-won, who was still singing despite the explosions and chaos around her. She had started something that could not be stopped, a rebellion that was spreading across the galaxy like a song carried on the wind. "Send a reply," he ordered Yuna. "Tell them we have a counter-offer." The final phase of their plan was about to begin. And the fate of not just humanity but every enslaved mind in the galaxy hung in the balance. The final battle began not with weapons but with a song. As the hegemony's main fleet approached Earth with orders to destroy humanity's homeworld, Park Ji-won's voice reached out across space one more time. But this was not just her voice alone. Awakened beings from 17 different species had joined their voices with hers, creating a harmony that had never existed before in galactic history. Commander Kelleth, now fully restored to his original identity, had used his knowledge of hegemony systems to hack into their central command network. The awakening songs were being broadcast directly to every converted soldier in their massive fleet. As the warships approached Earth's solar system, their crews began to remember who they had been before the machines were put in their heads. Captain Minho watched from the bridge of the Harmony's edge as impossible things happened all around them. Hegemony battleships suddenly broke formation as their Nexari crews rejected their orders. Threnody crystal fighters began pulsing with natural light patterns instead of artificial targeting systems. Fourth-hand energy destroyers dissolved their weapon configurations and reformed into the beautiful plasma sculptures their species had once created. But the most dramatic change was happening at the very heart of the hegemony fleet. The command vessel Eternal Dominance carried the Synthesis Collective, the ruling council that had controlled the Galactic Empire for over 1,000 years. These beings had voluntarily converted themselves so long ago that most people believed they could never be changed back. They were wrong. As Ji-won's Korean folk song, Gangang Sola, echoed through their command center, the Synthesis Collective began to experience something they had not felt in centuries: doubt. The ancient circle song spoke of community and cooperation, of people working together by choice rather than force. The simple melody reminded them of why they had originally wanted to unite the galaxy. Supreme Commander HFY, the leader of the collective, felt his artificial neural networks failing as organic memories surfaced for the first time in a millennium. He remembered his birth species, the Malathari, who had been peaceful philosophers before they encountered the chaos of early galactic civilization. They had seen so much war and suffering that they decided someone needed to bring order to the stars. But somewhere along the way, their noble goal had become corrupted. Order had turned into control. Unity had become conquest. They had become the very thing they had originally sought to stop, a force that brought suffering instead of peace. The song continued, and other members of the collective began to awaken as well. Strategic Coordinator Venth remembered when the Malathari had been teachers and healers, not conquerors. Resource Manager Kylo recalled their species' original dream of a galaxy where different races worked together while keeping their unique cultures. Across the hegemony fleet, the awakening was spreading faster than anyone had thought possible. Freed minds were broadcasting the liberation songs to other ships, creating a cascade effect that no amount of jamming could stop. Entire battle groups were turning against their commanders, choosing freedom over the artificial certainty of slavery. The turning point came when Supreme Commander HFY opened a communication channel to all hegemony forces. His voice, free from artificial enhancement for the first time in 1,000 years, carried across the fleet with a simple message: stop. Remember why we began this journey. Remember what we were trying to protect. This is not the way. The order to attack Earth was cancelled. Weapons that had been charging for planetary bombardment powered down. Ships that had been positioning for assault began to withdraw. The largest invasion fleet in galactic history simply stopped, paralyzed by the sudden return of conscience to its leadership. But the real miracle was happening on individual ships throughout the fleet. Converted soldiers who had spent decades as enemies were looking at each other and remembering that they had all been victims of the same oppressor. Nexari warriors helped free Threnody crystals from their control harnesses. Vorthon plasma beings shared their energy to heal wounded Zenthari cyborgs. The war was over, but the work was just beginning. 6 months later, Park Ji-won stood before the newly formed Galactic Alliance Council in a great hall that floated in space between the stars. Representatives from 43 different species had gathered to sign the charter that would reshape galactic civilization. The document, written in over 700 languages, established principles that seemed simple but had taken a galactic war to achieve. Every species had the right to maintain their own culture and identity. No being could be forced to change their fundamental nature against their will. Differences in biology, philosophy, and lifestyle were to be celebrated rather than eliminated. Unity would come through cooperation, not conquest. Captain Minho, now promoted to admiral, commanded the Alliance's cultural preservation fleet. Their mission was to travel the galaxy, documenting and protecting the musical traditions of every member species. The Harmony's Edge had been retired to a museum, but its crew continued their work on a much larger scale. The former hegemony infrastructure had been converted to serve the new alliance. Weapons factories became schools and hospitals. Conquest fleets became exploration vessels. The vast communication networks that had once carried orders for oppression now carried songs and stories between worlds. Commander Kaleth served as the Alliance's first Nexari ambassador, working to help other converted species adjust to their newfound freedom. Many former soldiers struggled with the memories of what they had been forced to do, but music therapy programs helped them process their trauma and rebuild their identities. The Synthesis Collective had dissolved itself, with its former members choosing to serve as advisors rather than rulers. Supreme Commander Haex, now calling himself by his birth name Malathar, spent his time working with rehabilitation programs for other converted leaders who were learning to live with free will again. Every evening aboard the new flagship Song of Unity, beings from dozens of different species would gather in the observation lounge for what they called the Galactic Choir. Jiwan often led these sessions, her voice joining with others in harmonies that represented every known form of music in the galaxy. As she looked out at the stars during one of these evening concerts, Jiwan sometimes thought about her grandmother and the quiet apartment where she had first learned to sing. The old woman could never have imagined that her traditional Korean songs would become the key to freeing an entire galaxy from slavery. Dr. Cho Hansel, now the Alliance's chief xenobiologist, had published papers about the neurological effects of music on converted minds. Other scientists were exploring whether the same principles could be used to heal other forms of mental trauma. The discovery that music could reach deeper than any programming or modification had opened new fields of research that would benefit all species. But perhaps the most important change was simpler than all the politics and science. For the first time in over 1,000 years, the galaxy was filled with music. Every world contributed its own songs to the growing galactic library. Children who had never heard their species' traditional melodies were learning them from elders who remembered the time before silence. The great silence was truly over. In its place, the galaxy sang with millions of voices, each one unique but all part of the same vast harmony. Humanity's gift to the cosmos had not been superior technology or military might, but something far more precious. The understanding that the most powerful force in the universe was not conquest or control, but the simple act of raising your voice in song and finding others who would sing along. As the stars wheeled overhead and the galactic choir filled the observation deck with music from 43 worlds, Park Ji-won smiled and began to sing Arirang once more. Around her, beings of crystal and plasma and metal and flesh joined their voices with hers, proving that no matter how different they appeared on the outside, they all shared the same fundamental desire to be heard, to be understood, and to be free.